I'm absolutely muted, aren't I? Yeah, fantastic. We're going to try that one again. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan Lewis, and today I am joined by Dr. Tate Paulette. Dr. Paulette is an associate professor at North Carolina State University's Department of History. He holds an MA and a PhD in Near Eastern Archaeology from the University of Chicago and an MA in Archaeology from the University of Edinburgh. His research focuses on urban food systems in the ancient world, as well as ancient alcohol, and has conducted archaeological fieldwork all over the world, including countries such as Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Turkey. He's here to me today to talk about his upcoming book, In the Land of Ninkasi, A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia. And that book is going to be coming out August 28th in the US and elsewhere November 24th. Tate, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, no, it's an absolute pleasure. Now, we were talking briefly before we came on and realized that I usually ask people to introduce themselves. I've essentially done that for you. So is there anything that you would like to add to that introduction so people can kind of get to know you a bit better?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I'm an associate professor in a history department, but I am an archaeologist by training. So, that means my specialty is dealing with all different sorts of physical remains. I do engage a lot with written documents, with ancient texts, but I'm trained a little bit in Sumerian and Akkadian from grad school, but I am not an Assyriologist. So when I'm working with that kind of stuff, I'm relying on the work of a lot of other people. My specialty is Mesopotamia, and more recently, kind of added Cyprus onto that, especially the 3rd millennium BC, but I also range pretty broadly beyond that. I guess I often kind of operate as a sort of generalist. I don't really have a methodological specialty, a subspecialty within archaeology, so I'm not like an archaeobotanist or something who studies ancient plant remains. I tend to sort of do a lot of pulling together work done by other people, trying to open up new perspectives on familiar topics, or like in this new book that I've written, what I'm doing there is really trying to pull together work done over, say, the past century by specialists and make it more accessible to a broad audience. I guess in terms of my own more specific interests, though, they tend to revolve around foodways broadly. So both like the production of food, so agriculture, pastoralism, cooking, food production in general, but also distribution. So who had access to food in various senses, and then consumption of food. So foodways broadly. And then I'm also interested in politics in the ancient world, and especially where those two intersect, which I often call gastropolitics, borrowing a term from Arjuna Padarai. Okay, that's who I am.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, what prompted you? How did you become interested in the study of ancient food and drink? Because that's, as with all academics, that's very specific.
Yeah, sure. I studied archaeology as an undergrad at the University of Edinburgh, as you mentioned. I guess I started out, I was going to be doing Celtic archaeology, so like Iron Age, Europe, basically. I ended up shifting to Mesopotamia, especially kind of under the influence of two kind of mentors there, Trevor Watkins and Eddie Peltenberg, who both worked on Mesopotamia, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean more broadly, and in particular Cyprus. So I got into Mesopotamia as an undergrad. And then I guess pretty early in grad school, where I was studying Mesopotamian archaeology at the University of Chicago, I was hired to work on this project called the MASS Project, Modeling Ancient Settlement Systems, which was this kind of collaborative effort to model the growth and collapse of cities using computer simulations. So we were partnering with Argonne National Labs, and I became a kind of like liaison between teams of specialists from the University of Chicago and then computer modelers out at Argonne. But then I also ended up doing a lot of work as part of that project on agriculture and pastoralism, because that was a key part of our models. So that kind of got me into the realm of food, kind of accidentally. I didn't really choose it. And then I ended up writing a dissertation about grain storage that was originally envisioned as an outgrowth of the MASP project. In the end, I didn't end up using these simulations in my dissertation, but there I really dove down into one particular kind of food, basically questions about like when you have the emergence of the first states in Mesopotamia, we know that they were storing up foods, especially grain, and redistributing it to the population. And I was trying to use the archaeological evidence for big storage facilities to try to answer questions about who exactly was receiving that food and what percentage of the population and that kind of thing. So I got interested early in grad school, and then I wrote this dissertation about grain, but then kind of during the later part of what was in fact a very long stint in grad school, I got involved in this experimental brewing project, and that's what really got me into beer. So I kind of fell into beer also. That was another collaborative project that was joining Great Lakes Brewing Company in Cleveland with the University of Chicago. So with the scholars from the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, ISAC, which used to be the Oriental Institute, which was where I was studying. So this was another of these kind of collaborative projects. And again, I kind of ended up being a sort of liaison or something between the two teams, helping the brewers communicate with the Assyriologists, archaeologists, etc. So that's basically a friend and I, Mike Fisher, we were both grad students together working on Mesopotamia. And at some point we had already decided that, well, we both like beer. They drank beer in Mesopotamia. Why are we not studying this? And we had started sort of dipping our toes into that. And then we were at this bar, the Map Room in Chicago one night, and Mike told me that he had heard about this collaboration that was starting. And so basically the two of us volunteered to join the team, and that has now ended up in this book I've written, I guess.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so I could say a little more about that if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. What was the experience like? Had you brewed beer before, or was this a new thing?
Yeah, I mean, I had done a little bit of home brewing, and I really haven't done that much since. Especially that kind of stopped my home brewing once I got involved in that. So, no, I mean, one of the real positives about this was that we were working with brewers who really knew what they were doing and had an intimate knowledge of these ingredients and processes and things. I mean, it was a great experience. I loved it. Yeah, I mean, just to describe a little of how that worked, I guess. I mean, basically, there are huge uncertainties about how they brewed beer in ancient Mesopotamia. And so it's really one of the great things about this sort of experimental archaeology, where we're trying to put into practice, some production process from the past, is that as soon as you try to actually produce beer, you run up against so many questions that you might not have thought about before. And especially those of us who are not really brewers, it's one thing to sort of write about how they might have brewed beer, but it's something else entirely when you're trying to actually do it. And so we came up, those of us on the University of Chicago side came up with a couple of page documents saying, like, here's how we think they might have brewed beer. We gave it to the team of brewers, and they sent us back an email with, 30 questions, many of which would have taken us years to answer, and maybe many of which were not answerable. And so we responded to those. And so we had this back and forth over email for a while, trying to hammer out a basic brewing process. So that was really the first kind of stages. Once we felt pretty good about that, we had to decide things like because one of our real guiding principles here was that we were going to try to use authentic ingredients and equipment and brewing process, not just brewing these beers on normal modern day brewing equipment, but trying to be as accurate as we could. So we had to decide which vessels to use. We had a ceramicist named Brian Zimmerly, who was working as a preparator at the museum at the time. And he made us a bunch of replica ceramic vessels based on examples that the Institute had excavated in Iraq in the early 20th century. And so we had this set of replica vessels. Basically, then there was a whole series of different efforts to actually put this into practice, doing some brewing. So we would go to Cleveland. Sometimes they did it without us. Sometimes we would go there. And so there was a lot of tweaking for a while. So that was a kind of middle phase, I guess. And then once we were happy with our beers, we moved into the last phase, which was we had a series of tasting events in different cities where we would give a series of lectures to people. We would let them try our beers. That was a lot of fun. We would always let them try 2 different beers, which we called Gilgamesh and Inky Brew, after Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And so the more authentic one was the Inky Brew, which was brewed on using the replica ceramic vessels and basically as close to the correct ingredients as we could get, and as far as we could understand the brewing process, like the correct brewing process. And then we would let them try that one next to this Gilgamesh, which was basically using the same ingredients, but modern brewing equipment, a different yeast source. And so they could taste these very different beers next to each other. And then we'd also let them try the Inky Brew in the sort of classic Mesopotamian way, which was from a communal vessel through long straws. And when at the first of these events, we put that vessel up at the front with some straws in it, and we thought, there's no way anybody's going to do this. But of course, absolutely everyone wanted to try it that way. So, it was a lot of fun.
What was the taste like? How does this beer compare to modern standards?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I should emphasize, there were lots of uncertainties here. So we did not produce an exact replica of what their beer would have been like. I guess the most obvious distinction is that it varied a lot in this, but it was always either tart or pretty sour. And many people today are now familiar with various kinds of sour beers, and so and we were kind of early in that sort of movement for these beers that have been around for a long time, but now have a much broader audience. So people were already starting to be comfortable drinking those. So yeah, there's always a sour element. And let's see, so usually they were not carbonated. And so that was always a clear difference. They often looked kind of opaque and milky looking, white to yellowish, whereas the one we brewed on the modern equipment looked kind of like you'd expect from a modern day like lager or something. A key difference is that they didn't have hops. So really one of the key flavoring ingredients for lots of beers today wasn't available to them. And so there are huge questions about what other ingredients they might have used for those kind of flavors. It's a frustrating kind of gap in our knowledge. So there eventually, especially during the first millennium BC, we have evidence for this particular plant called kasu that they're using to flavor beers. This is also a period when they're not just drinking barley beers, but they're also drinking a wine made from dates that they basically call beer. And so we know they were also using it to flavor that. But there are huge variations in how people have interpreted that term and what kind of plant that was. But basically beyond that, we don't know much. They did almost certainly use date syrup in many of their beers. So that's something that we experimented with a lot, but it matters when you use it. So and we don't really know when they would have. So if you add it early in the process, it's basically contributing fermentable sugars to the beer. And so you're going to get maybe higher alcohol content, that kind of thing. If you add it late, after you've already fermented it, it's basically like a sweetener and adding some other flavors. And so we did both of those things. And usually our audiences absolutely hated the sweetened version. So yeah.
And I have to say, it's the book has a whole chapter on ingredients and the intricacies behind deciding what these words actually mean in Sumerian and Akkadian and what we would recognize them as today. So if you are interested in that kind of discussion and understanding a bit more about some of the uncertainties behind this kind of research, the book has you absolutely covered. It's very detailed, but not terribly dense, in that I feel non-specialists would actually have a pretty easy time getting through it, understanding the different arguments for and against a specific identification, and really understanding what's going on there. When we look at this kind of work, looking at food or alcohol, what kind of evidence are you as an archaeologist working with to try and answer some of these questions?
Yeah, and I mean, So yeah, I'm an archaeologist, but I'm also drawing very heavily in this book on cuneiform texts of all different kinds, and again, heavily on the work of many other people. And so, yeah, maybe to start with the archaeological side, so just kind of physical remains very broadly. I mean, so we have, for example, architectural remains. So we have, it's actually been, archaeologists have had a really hard time identifying breweries, like the physical remains of breweries, but there's a couple. The best candidate comes from the site of Tel el-Hiba, ancient Lagash. There's also a possible brewery at Tel Hadidi, and there's a few others that I discuss in some detail in the book. We have also some potential taverns that have been excavated, and then especially at the site of Tel Bazi, lots of evidence for home brewing, where they've excavated about 50. They excavated about 50 houses, and they argue that basically most of those houses were brewing their own beer. And so we have this kind of architectural evidence. I mean, often what allows us to at least potentially interpret those buildings as related to brewing is other evidence like ceramics or different kinds of vessels. I think pretty much everyone would agree that, I mean, we recover huge numbers of ceramics on archaeological sites from the region. And I think we'd all agree that almost certainly many of those had some role in, beer production or consumption, but it's really hard without clinching evidence to show that this particular vessel was actually used for beer. So we're kind of in the early days of organic residue analysis in Mesopotamia, even though for the past few decades, this has really been taking off across the world, where you're basically analyzing the residues left behind in vessels so that you can say something about what they once held. But we only have a few sites where that's been done so far. So I think that our knowledge of which vessels were used is going to change substantially in the coming years. Also, all kinds of other evidence for like brewing ingredients. So archaeobotanical remains, like the remains of malted barley, which was a key ingredient in these beers. And that, in general, malted barley has been used by archaeologists in many parts of the world as a pretty solid indicator for brewing. Okay, so that's archaeological stuff. And of course, so when we talk about cuneiform texts, those are also archaeological in a sense, but they're studied by a separate group of specialists, Assyriologists. There's all kinds of written evidence for beer. I mean, from the very earliest cuneiform documents, they were writing about beer. And so beer appears in thousands and thousands of cuneiform texts. So that the most famous ones are two songs. One is a hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. And then always appearing on the same tablet with that is a song we call a drinking song. We don't know if that's exactly what it was, but both were definitely songs of some sort. The hymn to Ninkasi is what provides our best evidence for the brewing process in Mesopotamia. But I spend quite a lot of time, partly with a comparison to other sort of modern day drinking songs, saying we need to be careful how much we think we can pull out of this particular document, because it's basically praising the goddess of beer, Ninkasi, by showing us these little images of her at work in the brewery doing the key tasks of the brewer, and they seem to maybe be sort of arranged in a step-by-step fashion. So that's often been taken as evidence for the brewing process. So we've got those, but we've got, say, lots of accounting documents of all different kinds. One thing that I do a lot in the book to try, maybe just to touch on something that you brought up a minute ago. So one of my real goals here, so I've given lots and lots of talks to very different audiences about this topic, coming out of those brewing experiments and other things. And yeah, my sense is that I've always been really impressed by the kind of questions that people ask. I think it's easy to think that general audiences just kind of want to hear our big conclusions, but I don't think that's true. I think people are often very interested in how we got to those conclusions and what evidence we're using, how we're getting there. So that's really like a sort of guiding principle for the book, is that I tried to write it in a sort of lighthearted, engaging, I hope, fashion, but not avoiding these more difficult questions of evidence and interpretation. And so I use various little kind of semi-fictional vignettes to kind of try to pull readers in. So I sort of transport us back into the past. And one of why I was thinking about this is one of those is where I talk about these so-called archaic texts, basically the earliest cuneiform documents that we have. And I transport us back to the city of Uruk. And we're following this guy named Kushim through the streets of the city while he's on his way to work at the brewery. He shows up, he's in charge of the brewery. He shows up and checks on the workers there. And then he goes into the sort of archive room and checks on some tablets. And that's where we intersect with actual evidence. It's those tablets that we actually have preserved. But then I sort of pull back the layers and say, well, that's what we know, but we don't actually know that this guy was in charge of a brewery. He might have been in charge of like a storehouse. We don't know what that brewery or storehouse would have looked like, even though I've described it. We don't even know that it was actually in the city of Uruk. We don't really even know that there was a guy named Kushim. It might have been more like an occupational title or something like that. So I try to use these little vignettes to pull people in and then sort of dig down in and say, well, what is the actual evidence for these things? But these are wonderful documents, these earliest texts about beer that tell us about the brewing ingredients used to produce particular types of beer. So all kinds of accounting documents. Those are, across basically 3,000 years of history. Those give us a lot of insight, especially into the kind of institutional side of beer production and distribution, because that's what they care to, if you have like the state, like the palace and the temple, what they really care about is monitoring inputs and outputs. They want to monitor the ingredients that were given to brewers and then the beer that was produced using that. They basically tell us nothing about how they've actually made the beer, for example. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to ask, is beer brewing, and long-time viewers will recognize this, we're talking about several millennia worth of history. Is beer brewing typically a domestic activity, or is it institutionalized, or do you see a combination of both?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's definitely a combination. So we have the best evidence, especially on the written side, for the institutional aspect of it, because that's who was mainly producing the documents that we have. So yeah, the palaces and the temples, they maintained their own breweries. They had brewers that were in charge of them. We don't really know if those people were doing the brewing or more like supervisors. We know that they had sort of workers of different kinds working for them. We also know about taverns, but they appear less in the written record. They do interface with the institutions on the accounting side periodically, like when they have to pay taxes of different kinds. And so they show up there. And then I guess they really show up a lot in literature, where you see a lot about taverns and tavern keepers. And maybe something that we could talk about. I mean, so when it comes to brewers, there's evidence for both male and female, but I think that they tend to be male. In the realm of tavern keepers, you have both male and female tavern keepers. But if you're talking about literature, for example, it's like a quintessentially female occupation. And then we also I mentioned evidence for home brewing. That's very rare in the written record, but we do see hints about it, say in letters written between husbands and wives. And then we have some good archaeological evidence for it. But as far as we can tell, this seems to be something that was done by women mostly. So yes, yeah, I think I'm answering your question. Yeah, there's we have there's all different levels of brewing going on.
And for those who are interested, the letters I love old letters anyway, but there's one that you referenced where a wife writes to her husband and essentially says, I've run out of beer brewing materials, or they've gone bad. You need to send me money so I can buy more, which, yeah, I love those little kind of glimpses into real life.
Mm-hmm.
When we're looking at the consumption of beer, obviously in modern societies, it tends to be primarily a social activity. Is this the same in Mesopotamia?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it is a social activity in Mesopotamia. So yeah, for example, so I didn't mention when I was talking about evidence, one of our other really rich sources of evidence is artistic works of various kinds. And so we have actually very little in the way of representations of brewing, so the production side, just a couple of potential examples. But on the consumption side, lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of images showing the drinking of beer, especially, for example, banquet scenes, especially from the early dynastic period. I show quite a lot of those in the book, where you have people sitting around on stools, with attendants standing next to them, often sort of holding a conical cup in their hands. But then the reason I was bringing this up is the sort of distinctly social aspect. I mean, these are banquets, they're social occasions, but this particular kind of drinking that I mentioned earlier, which is drinking from a communal vessel, like a shared vessel, through long straws that would have usually been reed. So a very sort of social way of drinking beer. And so I talk in the book a good bit about these artistic, images showing that. But we also have some, in general, we do have some wonderful evidence for the straws themselves. We have super fancy ones made out of metal, but then most of them would have been reed, and reed doesn't survive well. But what we do have is these wonderful little sort of 5 centimeter high filters that were attached to the end of reed straws. They have little holes poked in them. And that would have been submerged into the vessel of beer to filter out any kind of solid matter. So we have quite a few of those. So you get, so banquets, taverns, a very social kind of space. They were drinking beer at festivals. I mean, all kinds of different social occasions. I mean, I guess we do. So there are depictions of people, of like solo drinkers, like an individual drinking through a straw from a vessel. And often when those little filters are found, they're found in burials, and there'll be a single one of them sitting within a vessel that was in the burial. So again, just probably a single straw in that. So I guess we don't know that there wasn't also, people weren't also drinking beer on their own, but it's definitely generally presented as a social activity.
Thank you. Do we see any kinds of taboos or restrictions on drinking based on age, gender, or was this something that was probably like universally accepted across the board?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't really know of any restrictions. I mean, certainly I'm sure that there were gender dimensions to drinking in Mesopotamia, but when we have drinking depicted in the artistic record, in literature, etc., it's very often a mixed gender affair. There's this interesting law from the Code of Hammurabi that's seen a lot of discussion about whether this particular kind of priestess, a Naditu, was maybe not allowed to enter a tavern or drink beer on pain of death. But there are all different opinions on how you should interpret that. That's the only, as far as I know, the only real restriction that I know of. The question of age is an interesting one. I mean, it's something I come back to a number of times in the book, just mainly because, well, I don't know of any age restrictions in Mesopotamia, but it's come up because there's often an argument made that the beers they were drinking were probably really low in alcohol content, and I don't think we can't like, certainly some of them might have been. We know that people were drinking beer on the job and things like that. Maybe some of these were low in alcohol and a little closer to food than drink, a little closer to like porridge or something like that. But the question of age, where it's really come up, is there was this excavation project at Tel Bazi. It's where it comes up in my book, at least, where this place where they excavated all these houses and some potential taverns. They attempted to recreate these beers themselves, and when they did that, they made an interesting argument for a different brewing process. They call it a cold mashing process, which means basically the brewing process didn't involve heat as it does today. It's an interesting argument. And But what often got picked up, say in the media and things, is that the beers they produced were really low in alcohol, maybe like 0.5 to 1.5% ABV. And as far as I can tell, that wasn't a result of the specific brewing process that they used, even though I think it was often taken that way. If you read the articles that they wrote about that, there's always a sentence or two in there that says, well, we know that in Mesopotamia, children sometimes drank beer. Therefore, the beers must have been low in alcohol content. Therefore, we're using a malt to water ratio that will give us low alcohol beers in these experiments. And I guess to me, that argument doesn't really hold water. I think
it's quite the assumption.
Cross-culturally, it's very common for children to be allowed to drink alcoholic beverages of normal alcohol content. So anyways, that's all to say, I don't know of much in the way of restrictions.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience. We've had a few people asking, is there any evidence for hallucinogenic ingredients being incorporated into Mesopotamian beers at all?
It's an interesting question. I don't know of any evidence for that. I mean, I would certainly be interested, but no, I'm sorry, I don't. Certainly, when looking at alcohol kind of globally, there's plenty of evidence for that. I don't know of any evidence from Mesopotamia.
Thank you. And do we know if Mesopotamian cultures used beer as payment for goods or services?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Do we know if beer was used as payment? Well, so in Mesopotamia, I kind of mentioned this when talking about my dissertation. So a lot of people were dependent on these central institutions in one way or another. That is, they received kind of rations from the institutions, from the palaces and temples. And usually the grain side of that comes in sort of, I think, unprocessed grain. There's lots of discussion of this. But beer is definitely not a normal ration. So in this sense, in these rations you could maybe consider them payment in some sense. But we do have some cases where workers and various people working for these institutions are being given beer very explicitly. And so there's some evidence in that sense where beer is a sort of ration / payment to workers. I don't think that I know of other evidence. Doesn't mean it's not out there. I should say, this book is a kind of overview and introduction to what we know about beer, but this is a giant topic. So this book is definitely not comprehensive. I would be very happy if it inspires some people to undertake more detailed studies of these kind of questions. I think there's so much space to do more with this. So I guess that's my only answers. I don't really know of other cases where it's being exchanged in order to get something. Definitely, taverns were commercial spaces where you could go and exchange, and trade for beer. So yes, it was an item of trade or exchange. That answers. Yeah.
Thank you. Now I have one more question before we finish up. And the book talks in several places about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is, I think, one text that the vast majority of people will have at least heard of. So can you talk very briefly about where beer turns up in that epic and the kind of roles that it plays?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's not like beer shows up all the time. There's a few kind of key episodes, I guess. The main one is early on, where you have this wild man Enkidu who's been sent in to sort of battle and befriend Gilgamesh. And so beer shows up at this really pivotal moment where he's being transformed from a wild man who's living with the gazelles out in the country and turned into a civilized human being. You have this woman, Shamhat, who's sent out to basically lure him back to the city of Uruk. She does that first by showing him her naked body. They have sex for like a week. And at this point, the gazelles kind of look at him funny and are like, you don't belong with us anymore. So that's the sort of like first stage of his transformation. But then you have this, before he can go with her back to the city, he has to be sort of turned into a civilized human being. And that means like giving him clothes, but also teaching him how he's been sort of grazing with the gazelles. He has to be taught how to eat and drink like a human, and that means basically eating bread and drinking beer. So you get this really pivotal episode in one of the great stories of ancient Mesopotamia where beer is playing a central role. And what it's basically showing us is that, that was like the quintessential drink, food and drink in Mesopotamia, bread and beer. And then I guess, later, beer is not exactly involved, but you have another famous character, Shiduri, this kind of tavern keeper at the edge of the world who Gilgamesh meets, and she gives him advice, kind of in an early version of the epic, this kind of philosophical advice about, like this quest you're on is futile. Humans are born to die. You need to go home, do your duties, eat, drink, and be merry, that kind of thing. In the sort of normal standard version, her advice is more kind of logistical, how to help him on his way. But I think that's the two kind of episodes where beer shows up.
Thank you so much. And thank you for giving us your time and your expertise. It's been really enjoyable to talk to you.
It's my pleasure. It's great to be here.
For those who are interested, the book again is In the Land of Ninkasi, A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia. That will be released in the US on August 28th and everywhere else on November 24th. It's highly recommended. It's a great book, packed full of really interesting information. And again, it really delves down into the evidence that we have and how we know what we know and why we don't know everything, or indeed as much as we would like to. So be on the lookout for that. And I will be back in a couple of weeks with another interview. Emily Wilson has published her second novel entitled, fittingly, Gilgamesh. So we'll be back to talk with her about that. So thank you very much, everybody. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Tate, thank you again.
Thank you.
Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/Digital Hammurabi to see how you can help.